It was August 10th, 1963, a Tuesday that simmered with the kind of oppressive, wet heat that makes the pavement of New York City feel less like a street and more like the floor of an oven. On the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, a wooden stage had been erected, draped in patriotic bunting that looked garish against the backdrop of faded brick tenements. Standing at the podium was Robert Sterling Miller, the golden boy of Sterling & Co's, a real estate conglomerate with offices in Midtown that were so high up in the clouds they rarely saw the grime of the streets below. Miller was a man who wore his arrogance like his bespoke gray flannel suit, perfectly tailored and completely out of place in Harlem. He was announcing the Harlem Renaissance Center, a project that promised to bulldoze 3 city blocks of urban blight to make way for glass towers, high-end retail, and, in his words, a civilized future for Upper Manhattan. The crowd that gathered wasn't cheering. They were watching with the silent, burning intensity of a jury that had already reached a verdict. Miller didn't care. He spoke over their heads, addressing the news cameras and the line of city officials standing behind him. He spoke of cleaning up the neighborhood, of removing the eyesores. He didn't know that the eyesores he was referring to were the barber shops where men debated politics, the soul food joints that fed the hungry on credit, and the jazz clubs where the heartbeat of the culture thumped until dawn. Miller had refused to meet with any local community leaders, dismissing them as shakedown artists. Specifically, he had laughed off a request for a sit-down from a man named Ellsworth Johnson. "I don't negotiate with gangsters," Miller had told his secretary. "I am bringing progress. Progress doesn't ask for permission." Miller was playing checkers. He was looking at the board and seeing pieces he could jump over. He didn't realize that across the street, watching from the tinted window of a parked Lincoln Continental, was a grandmaster who had already calculated the game 20 moves deep. Bumpy Johnson didn't look angry. He sat in the air-conditioned silence of his car, lighting a cigarette with a slow, deliberate motion. He wasn't looking at Miller. He was looking at a small, dilapidated shack wedged between 2 condemned buildings right in the center of the proposed construction site. It was a shoe repair shop, no bigger than a generous closet, maybe 10 square meters of rotting wood and peeling paint. The sign above the door read, "Old Joe's Soles," and inside sat Joe, a blind cobbler who had been fixing Harlem's shoes since the Depression. The Sterling & Cuss lawyers had circled Joe like sharks for months. They offered him money. They offered him relocation. And when that didn't work, they offered threats. But old Joe wouldn't budge. The corporation assumed he was just a stubborn, senile old man. They decided to simply build around him until the dust and noise forced him out, or until the city condemned the shack. They treated him as a nuisance, a fly to be swatted. What they didn't know, what their expensive due diligence teams had missed because they were too busy looking at profit margins, was that old Joe didn't own the shop anymore. The deed had been quietly transferred 6 weeks prior to a holding company called Mellon Enterprises, and Mellon was the middle name of Bumpy Johnson's favorite chess player. Bumpy had bought the shack for 10 times its value, allowing Joe to stay there as a tenant for life. But Bumpy hadn't bought it for the real estate. He bought it for what lay beneath it. Bumpy was a man who read. While other gangsters were reading racing forms, Bumpy was reading municipal archives. He had discovered a set of city blueprints from 1902, which revealed that the primary water main and the high-voltage trunk line powering the entire grid for those 3 blocks ran directly and inconveniently under the foundation of old Joe's 10-square-meter shop. It was the nail of the entire project. You couldn't build the towers without upgrading those lines, and you couldn't touch those lines without digging up Joe's floorboards. And you couldn't dig up Joe's floorboards if the owner said no. The war began on September the 1st. The sun was barely up when the ground began to tremble. A fleet of yellow bulldozers and excavators, branding the Sterling and Comter logo, rolled down 125th Street like an invading army. The foreman, a man named Kowalski, with a neck as thick as a fire hydrant, expected resistance. He expected protesters with signs, maybe some burning trash cans, perhaps a few rocks thrown. He was ready for violence. He had off-duty cops on the payroll, ready to crack skulls. But when the convoy turned the corner toward the demolition site, Kowalski slammed on his brakes. There were no barricades. There were no angry mobs chanting slogans. Instead, there was smoke. Thick, fragrant, mouth-watering smoke. Bumpy Johnson hadn't sent soldiers. He had thrown a party. Surrounding Old Joe's tiny shoe shop, in the middle of the demolition zone, was the Endless Street Party. Hundreds of Harlem residents were there. There were massive charcoal grills sizzling with ribs and jerk chicken. A 12-piece brass band was playing upbeat swing music that drowned out the idle rumble of the diesel engines. Children were playing tag around the legs of the perplexed construction workers. It was a festival of defiance. Bumpy had invited the families who were being evicted to camp out on the private property of the shoe shop and the alleyway he also controlled. Kowalski honked his horn, his face turning crimson. "Move it! Get out of the way!" he screamed. That was when a man in a pinstripe suit, carrying a briefcase, stepped out from the crowd of dancers. He walked up to the lead bulldozer, not with a weapon, but with a piece of paper. It was Bumpy's attorney. He handed Kowalski a court order, signed by a judge who owed Bumpy a favor from a poker game in 1955. "Good morning, gentlemen," the lawyer said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is an emergency injunction. Due to the fragile structural integrity of the historic commercial property known as Old Joe's Souls, the court has mandated a safety zone. No heavy machinery operation is permitted within 5 meters of the structure until a full geological and architectural impact survey is conducted to ensure the safety of the private citizens currently enjoying a lawful gathering on private land." Kowalski stared at the paper. "A survey? How long does that take? In this city?" The lawyer smiled, a shark-like grin. 6 months, maybe a year. Depends on the backlog." The project was paralyzed. The Harlem Renaissance Center, a $50 million investment, was brought to a dead stop by a 10-square-meter shack and a piece of paper. The excavators couldn't dig. The trucks couldn't unload. The water and power lines remained inaccessible. Every day, the machines sat idle. Sterling and Co. lost $20,000 in interest and penalties. For a week, the party continued. It became a symbol. The press started showing up. They took pictures of the massive, silent bulldozers surrounding the tiny, vibrant shoe shop like metal giants afraid of a mouse. The headline in the local paper read, "The David of Harlem breaks Goliath's ankle. Robert Sterling Miller was losing his mind. The board of directors was threatening to fire him. The investors were pulling out." He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he couldn't bully his way out of this. He couldn't bribe the police to bust up a peaceful party that had legal standing. He had to surrender. He had to meet the gangster. On the 7th day, under a scorching noon sun, Miller's limousine pulled up to the edge of the site. He got out, stripping off his suit jacket, sweating profusely in his white shirt. He had to walk. He had to walk past the grills, past the staring eyes of the grandmothers, past the laughing teenagers who knew exactly who he was and knew he was powerless here. It was a walk of humiliation, a pilgrimage to a power he had refused to acknowledge. In the center of the chaos, sitting on the elevated customer chair of the shoeshine stand outside Joe's shop, sat Bumpy Johnson. He looked cool, calm, and imperial. He was wearing a light linen suit, a fedora tipped low, and he was reading a newspaper. He didn't look up as Miller approached. He didn't acknowledge the man who had called him scum 2 weeks ago. Miller stood there, panting, his expensive shoes coated in the dust of the unpaved lot. The music died down. The crowd grew silent. It was a heavy silence, the kind that precedes a storm. "Johnson," Miller said, his voice raspy. Bumpy turned the page of his newspaper. The sound was crisp in the quiet air. "Mr. Johnson," Miller tried again, louder, desperation creeping in. "We need to end this. Name your price. I'll write the check right now. Double the market value. Triple. Just tell me what you want for this pigsty." Bumpy slowly folded the newspaper. He placed it on his lap and looked down at Miller. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and terrifyingly intelligent. He didn't smile. "Mr. Miller," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble that carried more weight than Miller's shouting ever could. "You have a vision problem. You look at this and you call it a pigsty. I look at this and I see the living room of Harlem. You stand there in your Italian shoes and you think you can buy a man's home like you're buying a pack of gum." Bumpy stood up and stepped down from the chair. He walked close to Miller, invading his space, forcing the developer to look up at him. "You wanted to build a castle, Mr. Miller, but you forgot the first rule of construction. You check the foundation. You thought you were walking among insects, but you forgot that even an elephant, as big and mighty as it is, will fall to its knees if a mouse bites it on the foot. I am that mouse, and I have very sharp teeth." Miller wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I can't wait a year for a survey. It will bankrupt the project. Please, what do you want?" Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. The crowd tensed, conditioned to expect a weapon. But Bumpy pulled out a folded document. "I don't want your money, Mr. Miller. Your money is dirty. I want your signature." He slapped the document onto the leather seat of the shoeshine chair. "The project proceeds. I will lift the injunction, but the blueprints change today." Miller looked at the document, his eyes widening as he scanned the demands. This is insanity." "It's justice," Bumpy said calmly. "Condition 1. The shoe shop stays. You build the plaza around it. It becomes a permanent fixture. Condition 2. The ground floor retail space? You don't lease it to chain stores from downtown. It becomes a market for the local vendors you evicted. Low rent? Guaranteed for 20 years. Miller shook his head. "That destroys the retail revenue." "Better than zero revenue," Bumpy countered. Condition 3. 40% of the apartments in the new tower. They are designated as affordable housing for the families of Harlem, not the rich folks you want to bring in, the people who live here, rent-controlled. 40%? Miller gasped. "That's impossible. It cuts the profit margin in half." "Then pack up your trucks and get off my street," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a door slamming shut. "Because if you don't sign, that injunction stays. And while you're tied up in court, I'll have every union man in this city walking off your other job sites. I'll bleed you dry, Miller. Not because I want your money, but to teach you a lesson about manners." Miller looked at the idle machines. He looked at the faces of the people surrounding him. Proud, defiant, united. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, a man who held the city in the palm of his hand without ever holding a public office. He realized he had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and completely defeated. With a shaking hand, Miller took a gold pen from his pocket. He bent over the old cracked leather of the shoeshine chair and signed the agreement. Bumpy didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply picked up the paper, checked the signature, and nodded to his lawyer. "File it," he said. Then he turned to Miller. "One last thing. The labor. You're bringing in crews from Jersey. That stops. Starting tomorrow, 70% of the construction crew comes from Harlem. We build our own walls, and you pay them union scale." Miller was too defeated to argue. He nodded and retreated to his car, a king stripped of his crown. As the limousine sped away, the band kicked back in. The party exploded into a roar of victory. But Bumpy didn't stay to dance. He walked over to old Joe, who was sitting in the doorway of his shop, listening to the sounds of victory. Bumpy placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "You keep your shop, Joe," Bumpy said softly. "Thank you, Bumpy," the old man rasped. "You're a good man." Bumpy adjusted his fedora, his face returning to that stony mask of the Godfather. "I'm not a good man, Joe. I'm a necessary one." He walked back to his car, leaving the celebration behind him. The Harlem Renaissance Center was eventually built, but it wasn't the fortress of exclusion Miller had planned. It became a strange hybrid, a glossy tower wrapped around a tiny, stubborn shoe shop that stood like a monument to resistance. The story of the Troy on 125th Street became legend. It wasn't just a story about real estate. It was a story about the nature of power. It taught the people of Harlem that power doesn't always wear a suit or carry a badge. Sometimes, power is simply the ability to see the board clearly when everyone else is blinded by greed. Bumpy Johnson proved that you don't need a crown to be a king. You just need to know where the pipes are buried, and you need the heart to stand between the elephant and the people it tries to crush. "Bricks build houses," Bumpy was heard saying later that night at the Blue Note, swirling a glass of champagne. "But men build cities. Never underestimate the man who holds the door latch, no matter how small the door is." And with that, the King of Harlem took a sip, watching the smoke of his cigar rise into the darkness, always plotting, always protecting, always 5 moves ahead.